smack that record button here. I think I got everything. Alrighty, welcome everyone. This will be our third recording under the natural order. Today, I have Paul with me, and we are going to take a dive on evolution. We alluded to it in our first video, talking about how it's such a core principle. I know Paul's handle on Twitter is actually the natural selectionist. I know it's an important concept to him. It's important to me. I think it's important to our larger movement. So we're just going to take a little bit of a dive into evolution. Anything you want to say up front, Paul?
Hey Tyler. Evolution honestly shaped a lot of my worldview. Reading The Selfish Gene changed my mind on quite a few things. It's something where a lot of people who say they believe in evolution, and that they're like say that it's a big part of their belief system, often end up left wing, and it's kind of odd to me because most of evolution points to tribalism and sex differences and things like that that are normally recognized a lot more by the right wing, and sometimes even by people who claim that they don't recognize evolution. So that's kind of one of the ironies of modern political life, and it's something that we need to explore and sort out as a movement. So I'm looking forward to doing a show about that.
Hell yeah. Yeah, I think we'll be able to cover a good bit of stuff on this one, but this session itself, like a lot of them, will likely spin off other topics, but we'll see how far we can get. I definitely do plan on getting into some of those political ramifications. I know last time or two times ago, you pointed out that funny kind of contradiction where the left, who claims to believe in science, is actually very dysgenic, whereas the right, the Christians who disagree with evolution, actually adhere to some of its principles, like unconsciously. So that's a funny one. And yeah, you really hit on a good thing too, just about the testimony about like how important evolution was for you. I'll say with me, it was like just earth shattering. I mean, just incredible. Up to that point, I grown up Christian, but I kind of had started to like see there were problems, and I was kind of floating in this like agnostic atheist type space, still trying to figure it out. And then like something like evolution comes along, and it gave me the confidence to like say that, wow, like, yeah, the Bible, Christianity does not have this shit figured out. If they miss this, if they did not go into this and include this, then they don't have it figured out. And so it helped me get out of that, and it also helped create a very powerful foundation for my new worldview, because it's just such a pervasive pattern. So it's really good to provide that context up front. It's a very powerful thing. I mean, and it is almost like a religious thing. I've called myself like what did I say, an evangelical evolutionist or something like that. Like, I try not to go like full on like Redditor, like cringe, because some people get that way, like with atheists and stuff. I saw this funny story on it was one of those 4chan green tags, and this guy was like, what do you say, like atheism turned me into a cringe, like a cringe 14-year-old. He said for Christmas when he was 14, he like did something, he like destroyed all the presents and like did something with a Bunsen burner on the tree instead of Jesus, and like tried to do this, and he's like, my dad beat the shit out of me and like gave all my presents to my brothers. So we'll try to find a balance, right? Like with all things, but anyway. So yeah, very good. So I figure what we probably do first is just give a little bit of context. Everybody who may be listening is maybe at a different place. Like, some people are like fully like, oh, I absolutely understand every single bit of evolution, or I know some of it, or I have no idea. So I think we'll just kind of start and talk a little bit about the basics, like, elevator pitch, or if you were explaining it to a 5-year-old, right? And the way I've done that is I've just said, the simplest definition is just adaptation via mutation and selection, right? And so we will kind of I was thinking we'll kind of stick to the biological first, because that's what most people think about when they think about evolution. They're thinking about biology and genes, which is important, and we'll go from there. So breaking that down a little bit, so mutation and selection is obviously the key, right? So mutation is anything that creates change, and so in the case of genes, in the case of DNA or biology, mutation is actual changes to those strands of DNA. And so I know the most common ways that I have, understand that mutation can occur in genes and DNA is either by UV radiation. Radiation can actually hit the molecules of DNA and create changes, or errors during copying. So whenever and I guess so whenever whenever a male and female of whatever species like procreate, It basically rips half a strand of DNA from one, half a strand of DNA or something, and it's mixed together basically. And so obviously in that, just the mechanics of that process are incredible and beautiful for one, but they're also very complex. And so there's naturally going to be, as perfect as it is, there's going to be some room for errors. So those are two ways I know. And then so if you think about like if DNA is this molecule that creates the instructions for everything that we are, from the color of our hair, to how perceptive we are, to intelligence, to the fur color of different animals. So if you're having errors in the copying or errors in the DNA, most of those errors are either going to be bad or just you're not going to notice them. They're going to be maybe small things that don't matter. But 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000 actually may help you. It may be a fur color that's more adaptive, it's a better camouflage. And so that this then ties into the other part, the selection. And that is basically whichever changes are beneficial, and beneficial means it's more likely to survive. Those are going to get passed on. So if you have a mutation in your DNA that gives you, like if you're a bear, like there's so many examples, right? There's a million examples. Everything in nature is an example of this. But I've always loved camouflage because it's a very easy one to understand. So if you have like a certain type of bear in a certain environment, if you have a mutation that gives you a good camouflage pattern, that color is going to help you eat. It's going to help you hunt. Or if you're a prey, if you're like a rabbit or something, it's going to help you survive and blend in. And what that means is if you're surviving, then it's more likely you're going to have kids, which means that those genes, that fur color, is going to be carried on. And so this small pattern, this small example carried over millions of generations is how we get the myriad of life today. And so I'll leave it there. I don't know if you have a better, different explanation, or if you want anything you want to point out.
That was definitely a good start to it. There's also epigenetics, where basically certain parts of your DNA will activate and other parts of your DNA will not. So, like when you
Yes.
look at your own genetic code, there's a good chunk of your genetic code that's basically just what they call like junk DNA that's not even activating or affecting anything. But some parts of that DNA, if you go back further, far enough in our ancestral tree, some parts of that DNA did used to activate. And sometimes, like, as you're living your life, the parts of your DNA that you need more, that get used more, those parts, like your DNA will basically tell itself, like, mark this part off, it's really good for us, we need to do more of this, and mark another part
Yes.
off saying, oh, we don't really use this part anymore. So DNA is quite a bit more complicated than, even a lot of what we thought that we knew. A decade or two ago about it, where it can literally tell itself which parts of the DNA strands, which parts of which chromosomes are more important, which parts are less important, which parts to use more of, which parts to use less of. So that process can be really complicated, and it can also result in some kind of weird evolutionary practices where we're kind of used to the genetic selection idea of, if this gene works, it survives. If this gene doesn't work, it doesn't survive. And there's a little bit more to it than that, where sometimes you will have a gene that's temporarily not working out, so your body kind of says, turn this one off for a while. But then when you get into a situation that needs it, your body's like, oh, hey, remember that gene that we had? Yeah, let's turn this one back on because we need it now.
Wow. Yes.
There's a lot of complexity to that, as far as how your genes are passed on and how your genes let themselves know from one generation to another which genes to activate and which genes not to activate. And so there are some people who kind of dismiss evolution by saying, oh, there's changes that happen too fast and, fast enough that genetic selection can't explain it. But
Mhm.
sometimes you've got epigenetics that do explain that, where, you've got an organism that maybe for many generations it was producing white fur because of a cold environment, but then it moved to a warmer environment. Well, it still had a gene in there somewhere for producing darker fur. And once it got to that warmer environment with less snow, it said, oh, hey, produce this darker fur because we're in a different environment. And so
Mm.
some people will look at how quickly an organism can change from one color to another, within a few generations and say, there's no way genetic selection can explain that. But sometimes there's epigenetic explanations for that actually do fully explain that. So you can see, changes happen a little bit faster from one generation to another because of a change in environment. If you're dealing with an organism that kind of already evolved to deal with that environment, but then had to evolve in another direction to deal with a different change of their environment, now they're going back. So some of the complaints that I've gotten from people who say, oh, there has to be, a divine or, like an intelligent creator or whatever overseeing the evolutionary process, which I'm not necessarily against that idea, but I don't think it's necessary to, to look at evolution and say, oh, well, there must be a divine creator, pulling the strings, because the epigenetic process explains how you can have, changes where you sometimes you have a very big change all at once that can't really be explained just by genetic selection within a couple of generations. But if you already had those genes sitting there dormant in your genome, epigenetics can explain why it would pull those genes out that had already evolved but were not in use.
Right.
So I do kind of push back against some of the people who try to dismiss evolution simply because they think that some of the changes that we've observed don't fully explain, uh, can't fully be explained by genetic selection, because epigenetics often can explain pretty much all of their complaints.
Hell yeah.
So I guess, yeah, probably the biggest example of that would be there was a species of moth in, I think it was in Great Britain, where when they were industrializing, the moth originally it was like a light brown that blended in with the trees, and then as they were industrializing and soot got all over the trees and the tree trunks got darker, well, just like that, within a couple of generations, the moths became black rather than light brown, and so some people who are critics of evolution would point to that and say, well, that happened way too quickly to be genetic selection. But if
Right.
those moths already had that gene somewhere in their genome, epigenetics totally explain how it would pull that gene out and say, okay, start using this gene instead of the other gene.
Yeah.
So that's one of the biggest complaints that I've gotten from the more religious people about evolution, and there are definitely explanations for why all of that stuff works. That said, I'm not necessarily against there being some kind of divine or spiritual power that is watching over us or that is guiding that process. I'm just saying that it's not necessary to believe in that to explain a lot of the things that we're seeing through evolution.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. So I guess I got three notes here. So one, that epigenetic explanation is even some of that is new to me. Like I've heard about like phenotypes and how things can like and how like some genes are like triggers for others, and how some things can kind of be consciously or subconsciously or triggered like that. So yeah, that just points to really to me it's just the beauty, the power, the complexity of evolution and the DNA. Like DNA itself is a part of that, and just how complex, yeah, how what's the right word, how plastic it's like. There's a type of I use the word, yeah, plastic, like how able to change it is built right into it. And of course we'll talk about like neurons and stuff like that later, but yeah, that's a really really good point. And the another thing you kind of alluded to was about the how it kind of fits into to religion and like the divine implications, and like people who talk about I've heard I've heard different reconciliation attempts by Christians, and I did plan on going into that maybe in a second. And then also you kind of talked about some of the core counter arguments that you run into and how we can address those, and I think that'll be another good one too. And because yeah, we don't need to spend a whole bunch of time like explaining it, because there's probably like other videos out there that like do it better and have like visuals and animations. And also like if you're curious to understand the basics of like evolution by natural selection, like there's so many good resources out there. But we'll talk a little bit more about auxiliary pieces of that. So I think we've done some good coverage of the basic of that basic mechanism of evolution via natural selection through genes, whether that's like hard changes in the genes or epigenetic selection triggers, switches, whatever you want to call it. So another thing I think that would be good to talk about is even in the biological context. So we're still in the biological context, but we've only talked about natural selection, right? So natural selection for our audience is is basically whenever nature is the selector, and that basically means that if you like if a rabbit gets killed by a predator, then like that's basically nature is that's a pressure, an evolutionary pressure, a selective pressure by nature to take those genes out of the pool. Likewise, if you die by a disease, if a bacteria gets in and you die, that's technically natural selection. That's part of just nature acting upon each other. So, okay, yeah. So that's good. So that's natural. So the next one we're talking about is probably artificial selection. So the greatest examples of artificial selection is probably like the domestication of animals like cattle, pigs, chickens, or even the domestication of a lot of the plants that we eat, like corn, bread, like so many plants, vegetables that we have, broccoli, potatoes. Like so many of those are variations of earlier forms, and that were selected consciously and intelligently. And this is where the artificial comes from, because it was humans acting on the environment to choose and select. They selected. And same goes with horses. We bred horses to be more docile and more responsive. We bred, obviously, dogs are also another great example. I'll make a side plug here. We're talking about other sources to get this information. The first 2 episodes of the new Cosmos documentary are great for this. They talk about dogs. And so all the diversity of dogs is humans saying, I like that trait, I like that fur color, I like your temperament, and so I'm going to let you breed, and I'm not going to let that one breed, right? So did you want to add anything to artificial selection before I move on?
Yeah, so a good example of that would actually be bananas, where, a few hundred years ago when we first discovered the banana, there were these giant seeds inside, and like more than half of the fruit was taken up by the seed. There wasn't a whole lot of the fruit itself, but we liked what there was of the fruit itself. So we started breeding it for smaller and smaller seeds, and now, now we've got seedless bananas that don't even have an actual like physical seed inside.
Yeah.
So yeah, a lot of the fruits and vegetables that you're used to picking up from the store today, if you went back in time, anywhere from a few hundred to a few thousand years and looked at their natural ancestors, the foods that you're eating today are almost totally different from them, because people spent generation after generation after generation saying, "All right, let me pick the seeds from the really good one, plant that." Yeah. And so, you can see plenty of examples where humans over time just selected for certain traits in animals and fruits and vegetables, and by selecting for those traits, they completely, totally changed the nature of the plant or animal. There was actually an experiment done within the last century in Russia where they took a species of fox that had never been domesticated and started selectively breeding it for domestication. And it took them about like roughly 50 generations or so to take it from being, basically fully wild to being fully domesticated.
Yeah.
It was within about the first 10 generations that they got the first animal that behaved like a basically domesticated animal. It was just, that was the first one, and it was just one in that generation. But you could kind of see slowly over time, like after 10 generations, they were a little more docile around humans, a little bit more friendly. 20 generations, more of them were docile and friendly around humans. There was less aggressive behavior even from the most aggressive ones. Uh, and so, you can see those changes happening just within the space of, 10, 20 generations. By the time you get out to about 50 generations, you can have like a pretty major change in the nature of an organism take place within about 50 generations. And in human years, 50 generations is like roughly 1,000 to 1,500 years. So when you look at human history, we've had civilization for long enough to have caused multiple major changes in humanity as we've evolved for civilization. Although,
Yes.
depending on what part of the world you're in and how civilized they were up until the last, 500 to 1,000 years, some people have had a lot more time to adapt to civilization than others, and some people are still kind of early on in that adaptation process and haven't quite gotten there yet. So there
Yeah.
are some definite differences between different groups of humans, and the concept of artificial selection applies just as much to human civilization as it does to the plants and animals that we've evolved over time.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point about how powerful it is and how fast acting it is, because it is so consciously driven. I mean, whereas nature, a lot of things are like random and are just like, happenstance, whereas artificial is like, I want that, and you're controlling it. So yeah, it's very powerful, very a lot more fast acting. I wanted one thing that was kind of funny to my mind is like going back to this idea of like a Christian perspective, or even or someone that doesn't understand evolution may look at things like bananas and all this stuff we have, like, wow, this whole planet and all this stuff was made perfectly for us. But they don't think about like how much, like, most of the stuff we eat wasn't even like that edible whenever we first got it. We've done so much shaping of our environment, and that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, one of the reasons I brought up bananas as an example is there's this kind of famous video of a preacher talking about, look at the banana and how it fits perfectly in your hand, and it's got this little tab you pull and you can just peel it so easily. God created this, and you look at a wild banana, and it's not like that at all.
That's so funny. Like it just, man, yeah. We'll definitely have to. We'll talk more about the Christian thing, and it is funny because again, they're like anti-evolution. We didn't come from chimpanzees and stuff, but they're like, look at banana. That's so funny. Oh man. What do I want to say? I think I covered it. Yes. Oh, you mentioned about how different societies have different amounts of adaptive pressure, and that kind of catalyzed some societies and some civilizations to kind of like technologically or whatever advance faster, and others who weren't. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll get there. So it sounds like we've got some good coverage of artificial selection. It's basically just the selection is being made consciously, usually by humans. That's probably the best like conscious artificial force. So the third big selective mechanism in biology is sexual selection. So this is basically like each. So the first of all, it's worth mentioning that sexual selection itself or sexuality itself was an adaptation probably very, very, very early on in the single multicellular organisms. It used to be asexual, like just like the way our cells now go through mitosis, they just copy themselves and just clone, and that's it. That's probably how that's still how it happens today, obviously at the cellular level. But at some point it was, well, what if we specialized into two, like the male and female, and then they paired. And what that does is basically each one, the females look for the absolute best male, and the male looks for the absolute best female. And so this creates an adaptive pressure. Each individual organism is trying to maximize and find the best partner. So that is it's a kind of artificial selection, but it's like instead of you like breeding and instead of like humans breeding animals or breeding plants or breeding something else, it's like you are a part of this. So it's like it is artificial in a way, and it's just such a powerful mechanism, right? So it's pretty self-explanatory, right? It's just like you're just looking for the absolute best genes, and that's pretty much it to pass on to your kids. And so, yeah, anything you want to add to that one?
Yeah, and one of the great things about sexual selection having evolved is, when you think about like single-celled organisms like bacteria or anything that, would reproduce asexually, if you get a really good adaptation that comes, in one bacteria and it goes off and creates more of itself, and then a really good adaptation in another bacteria that goes off and makes more of itself, those two never cross over. You never get the really good adaptation from both
Yes.
sides going into the same organism.
Yes.
Whereas in animals or even in plants, which not technically sexual reproduction, I guess, but they do mix with each other. As long as you can have two different organisms mixing their genes, well, now you can take the good adaptation that comes from one organism and the good adaptation that comes from another and overlap them into the same creature.
Yes.
So that was a very powerful evolutionary mechanism, and there's good reason why the creatures that reproduce sexually ended up taking over the planet, basically.
Right.
Billions of years ago, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, it's just another example, and that's just a beautiful thing. Like I think on the website I wrote down about it. Like just take anything, any aspect of life and just analyze it from an evolutionary standpoint, and it's likely the more important it is, the more ubiquitous it is, the more likely the more likely it has like a direct evolutionary explanation. So it's so powerful. So we've covered natural, artificial, sexual selection. This is all talking about biology, about genes, about DNA, and that's a huge part of it. I mean, it accounts for everything. I mean, like our vision, our eyes, like our intelligence, our language. Obviously, like we'll talk about, and maybe this is actually a good time to talk about it. We just talked about how like the emergence of sexual selection. So from asexual to sexual, this was a huge breakthrough in the evolution just overall that happened early on. So there are two other key moments. I say moments, but two other key developments in the evolutionary change that are very contentious to a lot of people and very important. So one, like we've already alluded to a little bit, is the monkey to man. And the reason obviously is because like as humans, it's like very earth shattering to be like, wow, we came from monkeys. Like we didn't, nothing else. Like we're related to all other life. And that's huge. I mean, that's hard for a lot of people to break down, as obvious as it seems at times. And so, from what we're talking about, it all makes sense. It's like, you've got the narrative that I kind of subscribe to roughly is that you've got, even today in Africa, you've got chimpanzees in these like tropical environments in these rainforests. I believe the theory is that some of the rain, there was climate change happening, just natural climate cycles, and it shifted some of these forests into more plains or savanna type areas where it wasn't as like not as much vegetation and forests and fruits and stuff. And so that created an adaptive selective pressure for them to basically become hunters, or also if they still wanted to find things from trees or bushes, they had to be able to walk and get from A to B without getting killed by a tiger or a lion. So that kind of created potentially some bipedal, some pressures that led to bipedalism, to collaboration, and then the whole hunting thing. So we can talk more about that, but that's a general. I'll let you interject there if you have anything on that one.
Sure. Well, I'm looking at how much things can change from a common ancestor. If you look at like Germans and Nords and Anglo-Saxons, a few thousand years ago, they all had basically the same group of ancestral tribes that they came from. And today, you can look at the typical German and say, well, they've got some traits that are different from the typical Brit. That they have some traits that are different from the typical Nord. So you can look at those different groups that came from basically the same ancestral stock a few thousand years ago and see how just a few thousand years has been enough to make some noticeable, significant changes between those three different groups. If you then extrapolate that to 10,000 years, 50,000 years, 100,000 years, you can see why different groups of humans who may have had common ancestors, 50,000 years ago, today very different. You look at East Asians who had a culture that was a lot more conformist versus Europeans who, ancient Greece and Rome were a little more individualistic. So were a lot of the Germanic tribes. So you can see how the different kind of societies that were set up affected the evolution of people in those different areas. So you can see how 50,000 years was enough to produce a difference between, East Asians and Europeans. It was enough to produce a difference between Native Americans and the East Asians who migrated across the strait into the Americas. Um, if you go back further to a few 100,000 years, you can kind of see how some of those pre-human ancestors, like the Neanderthals and Denisovans, and I think there's another one I can't remember the name of it that like sub-Saharan Africans have quite a bit of DNA from. But like you can see how some of those pre-human ancestral groups that were sort of similar to us but different, how some of them would have evolved over time and changed, and depending on what environmental pressures there were, would have created modern humans. And if you keep going and going and going, well, enough time is enough, is going to be enough to allow for bigger and bigger changes. So looking back and seeing, oh, our ancestors are monkeys, well, a few 100,000 years is a lot of time to make a lot of changes in people. I mean, everyone has some differences just from their own parents and grandparents, even though you get a lot of your traits from them. So if you can think about just the little changes that happen just from just within a few generations, and extrapolate that to hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years, of course there are going to be way bigger changes over that period of time. So I don't think it's unreasonable to to say that yeah, we did evolve from organisms that were lesser than us. It took a while to develop better traits and to pass those traits around, but it did happen. And I don't think it's something where we have to take offense at the idea that, oh, our ancestors were monkeys a million years ago, because who cares? We're not monkeys anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like you might have something about your parents or grandparents that you don't like, where you've changed it and improved, and multiply that by a million, and there you go.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, is it's important. It is important to know that that's where we came from, even as far as we have come, and to differentiate. It's like, oh man, I get it. I get why sometimes I just like chimp out basically because because that DNA is still in there somewhere, and so yeah. But in general, just that I see some Christians and some people who are like, well, I believe that there can be like small changes within a species, but not like macro between species, and I'm like, what determines one species and another is just compatibility. Like, if can you make a successful offspring, or make a successful offspring that can make successful offspring. Overall, it's a fairly arbitrary division, and like you said, like small changes over the course of hundreds, millions of years are going to naturally be like, okay, those things are different enough now that we're going to call them something different, or that we're going to forget that they even were related anyway because it's so different now. But yet that's the kind of pattern that has given us all of the. I mean, it's just mind-boggling to even think about. Even today, as long as I've understood that, it's just like, wow, everything from trees to all the diversity of mammals to fish to amphibians, reptiles, like it's all we all share a common ancestor. Like there is, if you go back far enough, we share ancestors with bacteria and fungi and single celled organisms. Like it's just mind boggling that all. But yeah, that process of course takes millions of years, and so. Like I said, the monkey to man is a big one for people, but if you can get over that and say, okay, I could see how species can change, I could see how all this stuff is, I mean, sure, I can get that. But another big hurdle for people, the other big one I wanted to mention, is the leap from non-matter to matter. And I don't know if we've talked about it before. I've talked about it a few times, but I believe it's called abiogenesis. And the theory is that basically, in an early Earth environment, you've got like methane, you've got basic gases, you've got a water cycle, you have water, you've got gases dissolved in water. It's all natural. And I believe there are the ideas about like, well, I guess you have like volcanic exhaust. But I think the core idea is that you've got this soup of water with these gases in there, and you get something like a lightning strike that hits it to catalyze a reaction, which can create amino acids, which are like the building blocks of proteins or the building blocks of life. And they've been able to recreate this in a lab. And, you know, obviously it's very complicated to imagine the full chain of how you go from a lightning striking some gassy water turning into, you know, the leap from there to amino acids to proteins to, you know, to more complex molecular structures, macromolecules and stuff. But, you know, to me, I've always believed the pieces were there given enough millions, billions of years. It's naturally some of these particles are going to start to come together and start to, you know, form the basic muscle structures, the basic nervous systems, the basic metabolic systems, you know, so yeah, so I just wanted to bring that one up. I don't know if you had any ideas about that one.
Sure, and as hard as that may be for some people to believe, like once you actually get to the point of a molecule that can make more of itself, a protein chain that can copy itself, once you get to that point, it's going to take off from
Smooth
there.
sailing, yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. So even if that's something where people are like, oh, you know, the conditions to make this are really, really rare, well, it can be really, really rare. You know, there's probably not life on every planet in our solar system. They're probably, you know, our not just our solar system, our galaxy. You know, obviously we're about the only one that has any kind of noticeable life on it in our solar system. But once you actually get to that point, however rare it is to get to that point, it'll take off from there, and it'll go off and do its own thing and make all kinds of new organisms. Um, so I do kind of get how people have that little bit of a hurdle to get past. But the thing is, when you know, however you feel about the 3 to 4 billion year long history of life that we've been told about in science class, you know, even if you have some doubts about that, you can still observe evolutionary processes happening today. You can still observe selective breeding, creating new breeds of dogs, creating new breeds of plants, creating all sorts of things. You know, you don't necessarily have to accept every single aspect of that 3 or 4 billion year long history. So if you're into some kind of occult or esoteric or conspiracy theory type thing, or maybe you think aliens or something like that, you know, came down and messed with life on the planet or whatever, that's fine. But you can still see evolution happening today. You can still see, you know, changes happening from one generation to another. You can still see human, you know, man-made selective pressure causing changes. You can see natural selective pressure causing changes. You can see sexual selective pressure causing changes. You can accept that these principles of how how evolution affects our lives today are true, regardless of what you feel about what happened 3 to 4 billion years ago. And I
Yeah,
think that's a lot more important to accept that today and to apply that to our study of, you know, psychology and of social sciences and governance and things like that than it is to argue about what may or may not have happened, you know, back in ancient history.
yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And that's why I don't, you know, just for the sake of this, I don't plan on going that far into it. But that's a great point about, regardless of where you think that leap came from, we can definitely see what has happened since, you know, when they got to the point of molecules being able to, you know, sexually select or reproduce themselves, copy themselves. Then the rest is, it's fine. We have plenty to go off of to live our lives and shape our societies and that kind of stuff. And I just wanted to go back to it briefly because it's funny, you know, this, like a lot of things, the evolution itself, it's kind of like, it may not be perfect, you know, we may not have like every single question answered perfectly, but it is a damn powerful pattern, and it is the best theory that is out there. And, you know, until something comes along better, sure, I'll entertain it, but And going back to abiogenesis in particular, that's kind of how I feel about that as well. It's like the best thing that's there is like, sure, maybe some kind of divine transcendental force, like somehow catalyze it, sure. Or people say, well, maybe life, these molecules came here to our planet from a comet. Well, where did they come from originally? They must have, or if aliens brought it here, well, how did the aliens first evolve? So it's like it ultimately leads back to the same question, and then it's either a question of did it happen this way, or divine, or some other way. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. Just wanted to mention it briefly. So I think we've already alluded to where I want to take this next a couple of times, which is talking about some of the other, we've been talking about biology mostly this whole time. We've been talking about DNA and biology, but one of the biggest messages that I like to get out there is that evolution is just a pattern that can apply to more things than that. Just this idea that you can have mutation, you can have things that just change, and then you can have selection. Okay, out of all those 10 changes, this one is the best, so I'm going to keep that one going. So obviously the two next biggest ramifications of evolution that you would want to apply it to is psychology. So, as evolution develops and develops nervous systems and brains, it gives us the ability to artificially select. And that includes not just selecting who we partner with or selecting what dogs we want to breed, but also just it's a question of learning in our own behaviors. And so we're not talking about, so what we are talking about is psychology, and we're not talking about a whole other organism. We're just talking about what behaviors work best. So I can mutate, I can do things so many different ways. I can try different things, I can experiment, I can mutate my behaviors, and I'm going to see what works. Which behaviors help me procreate, help me get a partner, help me secure resources and food, and which ones help me avoid predators and danger, and which ones don't. And so these are all psychological. These are things. These are mutations and evolution and adaptation that happens multiple times within someone's lifetime. And you can obviously pass it. You can still pass these behaviors to your kids, whether through teaching them or at some point it actually becomes, I think, wired into our brains and into our DNA. So there's this whole realm of evolutionary psychology, which again, there's plenty of other resources out there. Check Wikipedia, YouTube, plenty of books like evolutionary psychology. It explains, once again, everything that we do, from our anxiety to our emotions to our rationality to our language to our ability to navigate the environment. It is all things that helped us survive. And so it's just super powerful. And so the next one I'll talk about is sociology, but I'll pause there if you do have anything you want to add to the psych. I know you've been itching to get to the sociology, anthropology bit. Me too, but anything psychology related?
Yeah, well, so even some of the emotions that people think of as kind of negative emotions, like, anger and fear and anxiety and hatred, things like that, like, they did evolve for a reason. You have those for a reason. And so sometimes when you know, people are like, we hate hate, or, end all hate. Well, you developed hate for a reason. Maybe it's there for a reason, and maybe there are times in your life where you have to feel some of those negative emotions, just like you have times in your life where you definitely want to feel the positive emotions.
Right.
If something is a threat to your survival or a threat to the survival of the people that you care about, you probably should be angry at it. You probably should be afraid of it. You probably should have some of those negative emotions about some of the things that are dangerous to you, some of the things that threaten your ability to survive and the ability of the people that you depend on to survive. So, sometimes those more negative emotions, they get a bad rap from people, and you know, there's a whole political movement that wants to wipe an entire emotion off the map, but that's like trying to get rid of that emotion is dangerous to your survival. You have those emotions for a reason, even if they're not pleasant. And
Right.
so I do think that having a more evolutionary view of psychology is a good thing, because it helps you remember that, whatever's going on up here, oftentimes it's going on there for a reason. And even some of the things that may look like, a psychosis or something, yeah, we don't evolve perfectly, so sometimes you will get something that's wired wrong and not good for you up there. But some of the things that get classified as, a mental disorder aren't necessarily a disorder, and
and vice versa. Some things that are
yeah,
some things that are mental disorders are not being classified as such, right?
even though they should be. Yeah, so definitely I think we need to have a more evolutionary view of psychology and how we identify things, because yeah, there are some behaviors like transgenderism that get in the way of passing on your genes that should be considered a disorder. and there are some behaviors that maybe are classified as a disorder because it causes you to have some more friction with the people around you, but maybe there's an actual legitimate reason why some people do that and why some people feel the need to behave that way. And I think that we definitely need to take a whole new look at psychology from an evolutionary perspective rather than from some of the more classical perspectives or some of the more like left wing blank slate kind of perspectives that are starting to dominate things today.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good point too, is the fact that we can still mutate either something entirely new or just the behaviors using the existing psychology and neural mechanisms. Different things can be wired improperly. So there's still possibility for that. And yeah, I think I had another point too. I may have lost it, but generally on the right track. Oh yeah, too. I was gonna say that it's kind of a point of balance too. Like things like anxiety, for example. Like we have anxiety is almost like a fear. It's like a very core. I think it's the amygdala. It's like a very like fight or flight, like assessing the situation. Am I in danger right now? And of course, that's a great thing to have. We have it for a reason, but sometimes it fires a little bit too much for people, whether that's a wiring problem, a genetic problem, or some other thing. Sometimes it's just like you're freaking out for no reason. So anyway, that's just another good example of how we have it for a reason, but sometimes it's out of balance or sometimes it's not wired properly. And then there's a whole discussion about, okay, is there, this is just a huge discussion about all these things, like how much of it is actually genetic and like hardwired versus software, so to speak. I constantly refer back to like a computational model of our brains. I think about it like a computer, like an operating system or like software. And so is it the hardware that's the problem or is it the software that's the problem? And where can I fix it? If I'm depressed all the time, do I need to be going outside and just doing behavioral things and like reflecting and cognitive behavioral therapy, or do I need to be taking drugs for it? Of course, the pharmaceutical complex and this stuff is more than happy to give you drugs for it. So anyway, that's a whole other discussion, but yeah, so we just wanted to lay that frame.
That's a good discussion to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. I mean, and this is going to start to tie in. I mean, some of these threads are going to start to cross, but in general, I just wanted to reframe it as this: evolution can apply to not just biology, not just to our actual physical traits, but obviously getting into our psychology. We developed intelligence in our mind as a brain, as a central nervous system to help control and help us navigate the environment and construct mental models and interact with other people. And so this is where I think we've been itching to go next, and which is into the sociological ramifications. So you've got individual psychology, but what group behaviors, what group strategies are most evolutionary beneficial? And this is we've already alluded to, like different tribes and different civilizations and selective pressures. And so this is obviously also where it gets into the political realm, because we are in politics, we're trying to create law and create infrastructure that will basically help us live the most successful lives and survive and compete with other nations. And so we have to ask those questions about, we absolutely should be basing that process on this. And it's the same thing. If evolution is what is led to millions of years of biological evolution, if it accounts for all life, if it explains how we got here, why we think the way we do, so why would we not also apply that to our governments and our civilizations? And so that's kind of where we're going next. And so, yeah, is there anything you wanted to add to that? I know you've been alluding to it a couple times. There's plenty to say there for sure.
Yeah, I'm almost like not sure where exactly to begin with that because it's such a huge topic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that could be a whole other point. Let's see, we're at about 43 minutes, so I'm okay to go at least another 30 or so we can dive into it. I think that'll probably characterize the rest of this discussion, if not more.
Yeah. So I guess as far as some of the large scale changes that have happened to us, when you look at, I guess I talked a little bit about this earlier about how, East Asians and Europeans and Africans kind of develop different traits based on some of the differences in their civilizations. Some of that does sort of come from the environment. So if you look at like China, for example, you've got this like central set of river valleys that are, all in the lowlands and then kind of surrounded by a big ring of mountains. And so for a lot of their history, the people living in those river valley lowlands, it's great agricultural land. You can support a lot of people there, but you're surrounded by lands that are a lot harder for you to take over than it is for them to come down and take over your land. And so because you had this large population that was constantly under threat of invasion from, Mongolians and Huns and other people living up in the mountains, they had to develop a much more like unified and cohesive culture that was where, everyone kind of had to obey the rules a little bit more. Everyone had to band together a little bit more in order to hold off invading forces that were a lot harder for you to go out and fight than it was for them to come to you and fight. So that had a big change on you know, their mental processes over time, that because their survival depended on them having a different behavior pattern and depended on them, banding together and being more obedient and, you know, following a very large group that, all kind of lived in this broad area, but there was a very broad population center, very large numbers of people living in the same area. That affected how they had to behave in order to survive. Whereas you look at Europe, there's a bunch of little mountain ranges. You've got, separate little areas with their own little river valleys. So you've got a lot of separate small civilizations. You look at like Greece, where you had a bunch of different little city states on their own peninsulas, their own islands, their own little areas, where each city state could kind of go off and do its own thing. And it was really hard to unite everyone under one banner, whereas in China, everyone's kind of living in the same easy to conquer area. Once one person takes off, they're going to conquer the whole area and control everyone and make everyone conform. Whereas in Greece, it was, some of the wars that they had in their early history, it was almost impossible for one city state to conquer all the city states around them just because of the way the terrain was, because there were so many little islands and peninsulas and mountain ranges and things like that that got in the way. So you had these little individual city states that could have their own completely different culture from everyone else. So Athens had a totally different culture from Sparta, who had a totally different culture from Thebes, who had totally different culture from each of the other Delphi and Corinth and all the other city states. And so that led to a much more localist and individualist culture where you could be your own man with your own opinions a lot more in ancient Greece than you could be in ancient China. You could be your own man with your own opinions more in in Germany and France and Britain than you could be in the in the Far East. And because of that, Europeans developed a whole different behavior pattern, a whole different set of behavioral patterns than people in East Asia, because we evolved in a totally different environment that led to more localism, more individualism, rather than big giant sprawling empire. Um,
Hell yeah.
and you definitely do get a whole different behavior pattern depending on whether you're living in a big sprawling empire where the same exact set of rules is being imposed on everyone, versus when you're living in a small isolated community where your community can do your own thing. And even if you end up deciding you don't like your own community, well, there's a whole bunch of little isolated areas where you can take your family and go live off on your own with a handful of people that think like you and start your own community. And so Europe developed a much more individualist and localist, it's kind of small tribe based outlook on life, because they didn't really get united under a single empire until Rome. And even under Rome, they kind of had to make provisions for, well, this local group over here is going to worship their gods and have their culture be a little bit different, but as long as they're paying taxes, we don't care. Versus in China, where, you know, yeah, there were a few different philosophies like Confucianism and Buddhism and Taoism, but uh, each individual still kind of had to conform a lot more to whoever was in power at the time in China than they did in Europe. And so that led to a very big difference in the way that we look at the world, where East Asians are very conformist, they're very obedient, whereas Europeans, we've got more of a rebellious spirit to us. We've got more of a self-sufficiency to us rather than a group conformity spirit to us.
Right. Hell yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great framing of one of the fundamental differences between the East and West. And I love, like, it's so cool to me, like, tying it into geography, because so much of it does come back to geography, whether that's proximity, whether that's just like the biome or the terrain. The terrain. There's so many factors of that. But yeah, you see how that manifests. Like you said, if you're based on the terrain, if you're more susceptible and more vulnerable, you've got to be more collaborative. You've got to group together with people. You've got to be more unified and conformist. Whereas if you're just over here in these like separate like steppe mountain environments, you've got plenty of protection. You're fine. You can just have your little war band and your tribe, and plus you're farther away from anything too, so you're fine that way. Yeah. So and it's funny too, because like I've obviously heard that and understand that like Asians are more like kind of more unified and conformist, and Westerners are more individualistic. And I had not I have heard some of the explanations for why the West is the way it is. I haven't heard as many for the East. Yours is one of the first I've heard, and that's the beautiful thing about evolution is like you don't have to have every single piece. It's just like you understand that like the way that tribes are or people are probably has something to do with their environment and their pressures, and so it's just like, oh, okay, that's just another little piece of the puzzle that fits into my overall frame, and so that's just why it's such a powerful overall pattern and frame, and then you just start to work out the details and it fits perfectly. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, that's really good. So that is a kind of talking about. I guess that's kind of talking about race ultimately because it's like, okay, yes, you've got the Homo sapiens species, but then that's what, so much of our political discourse and our contention today revolves around race, which is basically just like you could call it like a subspecies because obviously pretty much most of most Homo sapiens, most all humans, I would assume, can make successful, viable offspring. Now there is some contention, more discussion to be had there about how successful, but in general, you can make viable offspring. So we are still a human species. However, there is a lot of diversity. There is a lot of differences between just because we're talking about hundreds of thousands, potentially even millions of years. We're talking about completely different environments. You've got some that evolve for deserts and some that evolve for tundras and some that evolve for islands and tropical. I mean, it's just incredible different environments and different foods and animals and then you've got different languages and customs and philosophies and technologies and war strategies. I mean, there's just so much, so many different factors that we've mutated and have been selected. And so again, this gets back into the political. We're unable to even have racial discussions today. A lot, and this is again, yeah, we're getting into political because one of the main narratives that's coming along is very anti-evolutionary. They're very just like ignore everything about what evolution does about survival of the fittest. This works and that doesn't. Like you said before, like the idea of hate, like you should repel some things. Like they're totally they're totally disregarding all of that and saying we're all equal. Everybody's the same. We just have the skin color is the only difference. There's no other differences. And like that's such an insult. That's such an insult to millions of years of evolution, of cultural evolution, of genetic, of the way our brains actually work and the way that they're wired. I mean, there's so much that goes unaccounted for there. And so this is one of the fundamental divisions between what I see as the right and left. I mean, Christians are kind of their own thing. Like we said, they're kind of proponents of evolution without knowing it in a way, sort of. But really, it's about the new right is like all natural selection, evolution, and the left is just like pretty much the opposite. Like between Marxism and all this kind of stuff, it is a total disregard for these components. So yeah.
Well, in the grassroots and dissident right, like our view on that kind of thing is very different from the sort of mainstream corporate, Fox News type of right. So
Exactly.
you
Yeah, it's
kind of
almost
have
like a
to
whole
separate
separate
that out.
thing.
Yeah,
Oh,
but yeah.
and so yeah. Sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So one thing I'll bring up as far as human biodiversity, that a lot of the people who try to ignore the differences between different races will also say that they're for diversity, that they support diversity. But what they often don't realize about that is diversity means different kinds of people are different. So if you believe that everyone is basically the same, you don't actually believe in diversity. You don't even believe that diversity exists within the human species.
Right.
Whereas it's only when you start recognizing that, oh, different groups of people think differently, we behave differently, we have different sets of skills. That's that's where diversity begins. Diversity means different kinds of people are different. So if you don't know what the differences between different kinds of people are, you don't actually know what diversity is, let alone support it. And you can look
Right.
at different groups of humans and say, well, you know, we have different survival strategies. Well, this survival strategy does work better for their people, and this one does work better for our people, and that one does work better for that other group of people. You can look at the different abilities we have, and like East Asians have a higher like logical, mathematical type IQ than Europeans do, and that's a good skill that they have. They're also less athletic than we are, and they're not quite as like creative as we are. So there are some differences there where, yeah, there are some benefits to being East Asian. There are also some drawbacks to being East Asian. Then you look at Africans. Well, they're pretty much the most athletic race. They do have they do have some creativity. It's not. It's maybe a little different from European creativity in terms of what we create. But you can look at like the music industry and see that black
It's more
people
soulful,
are
like jazz and blues
yeah,
and rap and hip
jazz,
hop.
blues,
Yeah.
rap, hip hop. Yeah, like they've pioneered many different genres of music. And even some of like the early rock and roll artists, some of that grew out of black music, and then white people kind of took it and ran with it from there. So you can look at things where black people do excel, but then you look at their logical and mathematical IQ, and they're, you know, black Americans are like 15 points behind whites, and full-blooded Africans are like 30 points behind whites.
Yep.
And that's a drawback to them, and that drawback doesn't take away from their strengths, nor do the drawbacks of any other race negate the fact that they also have their own strengths. Different groups of people are going to be better at certain things and worse at certain things. And if you don't know those differences, if you don't understand those differences, how can you advocate for diversity if you don't even understand what diversity is? I think for people on the left, like, they're going to have to at some point recognize the scientific reality of the differences between different kinds of people. And so my advice to them, even though I'm not a proponent of, forced mixing, if you are going to be a proponent of more immigration and more intermixing between the races, learn what the differences between them are. Learn what different groups are good at and bad at. So that way you can say, well, okay, maybe we do need more immigrants from this place because we need more people who are good at this thing that group of immigrants is good at. At least if you can, make the argument from that standpoint, you can actually have a valid point. Whereas if you're just saying, bring in millions of people who are different from us because they're exactly the same as we are, that doesn't make any sense. It's a completely ridiculous argument. How can you even sit there and argue for that when, you're arguing for diversity because everyone is the same, but diversity means different kinds of people are different. So it's a completely absurd, illogical fallacy that people on the left have that, on the one hand, they think that we're all the same, and on the other hand, they want to mix us all together for the sake of diversity, which means that we're all different. And I really don't think that you can build a worldview based on that and have it make any kind of sense or work out for anyone. But I think if they were to take the worldview that different kinds of people are different, and sometimes it is okay to, have a few communities of different kinds of people because they have different skills. I think if you look at things that way, you'd actually probably be more interested in diversifying places like Africa, where they're having a lot of economic trouble. They maybe need some people who have different sets of skills to come in there and help them out. More so than you'd be interested in diversifying East Asia or Europe, where we're capable of building a functional society without a wider variety of people. Where we might need a few pockets of different types of communities within our country, but we don't need 10% of our population or 30% of our population or 50% of our population to be people from different parts of the world. Maybe 5%, maybe 2%. Whereas in Africa, where you've got countries where the native population can't even feed themselves, well, okay, maybe you do need to bring in 10% of the population being European or East Asian, or somebody who can take on kind of those management positions and help instruct and teach the people in your country to do a better job at the things that they're going to do. And so I think if we looked at the world that way, we'd come up with a very different immigration pattern. We'd have different, breeding patterns. We'd probably have a higher birth rate in East Asia and Europe and be like, okay, let's send some people from those countries to the poorer parts of the world, rather than pushing a high birth rate in Africa and Latin America and saying, let's bring millions of their immigrants into, Europe and America and East Asia, because that's a recipe for collapsing civilization as we know it. Whereas if we took an actual, biological evolution-based view of these things, we could build up the third world, but we'd have to do it by having the third world take more immigrants from places that are actually functional today, rather than having the third world send people that can't build a functional civilization on their own to countries that are already functional well.
Right. Yeah, it's like, to me, going back to what you're saying, like, that is a what we're talking about is a celebration of diversity, is being able to discriminate and be able to see the differences. And what's so funny is that is their definition of racism. Like anytime you're discriminating between races or just like noticing differences, like that's racism. Whereas to us, like that is a true celebration of diversity. We're like, wow, this group of people has a unique culture, a unique heritage, evolutionary lineage going back hundreds of thousands of years. They developed. That's beautiful. That is beautiful. I want to celebrate that. I want to preserve that. And what we're seeing, like we talked about, is like all these other countries are able to preserve theirs because no one wants to go there, whereas they all want to come here to the Western countries. And so we are losing our homogeny, we're losing our integrity, we're losing our diversity, we're losing what makes us unique and we're just totally being like attacked and diminished in the process. So this is a huge part of the concern. And you're right too. It's funny, like we talk about colonialism. Like colonialism you hear the left like, oh, the whites are the conquerors and they go and fuck all these places up. But I mean, it's like you're saying, it's like we literally brought civilization and trade and technology and so many things to these places. And yeah, it wasn't always pretty. There probably was a lot of violence, just like there is violence between any other in-group fighting. You've got African tribes killing each other and conquering each other. Like it's just part of nature. So it's a whole discussion. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
So
well, and they blame us for slavery, but you look at the descendants of slaves in America today, and they're the best off group of black people in the entire world.
right,
So,
yeah, exactly. It's that funny question of like if you gave them the choice to undo what happened with slavery, would they? I mean, as horrible as it was for their ancestors, it was a ticket for them into the first world and to integrate into society. Versus if they hadn't, they would probably be stuck in these like bad situations like you see throughout a lot of Africa. Yeah, so
yeah, you
that.
compare like Haiti to some of the other Caribbean nations where, Haiti's like 98% black and they killed off all the white conquerors, and today they're basically starving to death, whereas some of their neighbors that are, half black or less, that, have large white populations are doing great, and even the black people in those countries are doing a lot better than the black people in Haiti who are starving because they drove all the white people out of, a couple hundred years ago.
Right. Yeah, so it's just to bring it back to the frame is just again race is just a part of this evolutionary conversation, and if we can frame it properly within this evolutionary connotation, I think we can have good dialogues. I understand, the concern from a lot of people because they're like, oh, well the Nazis were into eugenics and we're into that. Well, it's like, well, that's part of what they got right. I mean, that's honestly they were onto something, and of course, like happens often, they may not have carried it out well. This was one of the first times that evolution was in natural selection was being consciously like shaped in a society. So it was like a painter trying to paint their first painting. It's like, okay, well, I tried, I learned some things, and it wasn't great. There, people died, right? But it also,
like the U.S. had a eugenics program at the time. Great Britain had a eugenics program at the time. Not necessarily like at the government level, but there were definitely private organizations encouraging eugenic selection among
right,
among couples in those countries. There was a eugenics movement in both those countries. So people kind of heap the blame on the Nazis and use the fact that they were the losers of the last big war to kind of discredit basically everything that they tried to do. Well, if we took that to its logical conclusion, we wouldn't have animal rights laws or like good treatment laws basically for livestock. We wouldn't have environmental regulations because the Nazis pioneered those. There are a lot of things that a lot of the people who hate the Nazis look at and say, "Oh, this is a good thing," and don't realize the Nazis pioneered that.
yeah,
And there are a lot of things that they're blamed for that a lot of other countries were doing at the time that they were kind of used as an excuse to get rid of that policy, even though that policy was working well.
yeah. It kind of reminds me of the meme where it's like it's a painting and it's like you just enjoyed one of Hitler's paintings, like.
Yep.
it's like we absolutely have to get past that because like that like what happened with the Nazis and Hitler being used to like totally discredit any efforts to incorporate evolution into our society is a travesty. I mean, that's gonna if we don't fix it, we're gonna run ourselves into the ground. We absolutely are gonna have civilizational collapse, and we're in the middle of a lot of that right now. So whether we can turn the ship around or whether the ship has to crash and we have to build it back again, we'll find out. But I did want to say that that race is just one of these things that we talked about, like other things like culture, IQ, gender is huge, like understanding gender cognition, gender roles. I mean, that is a huge discussion that gets very political. But we need this evolutionary frame. It is a scientific frame, is what it is. It is a truthful scientific frame, and the most logical, rational frame you could have. And that's not to mean we should throw feelings and compassion and all these things out the window, because those things are a part of this frame. Like we have feelings, and we have empathy, and we have compassion for a reason, and that's part of it. And so there's so much of a balance to be found. There's so much of a better conversation to be had. And I wanted to go back to maybe a little bit of a full circle. We talked about how the new right, who embraces evolution consciously, kind of differs from the old right, the Christians, who kind of have an evolution, like they care about family and they care about some of this stuff just because it's tradition, because it's in their religion. But there's a distinction between those two, and this is kind of what it's about. It is about evolution, and what was I going to say? We don't often break it down to this level like we're doing right now, and I think a lot of the reason is because like we agree with the old Christian conservatives in a lot of ways. Like we don't want immigrants playing in our country. Like we don't want like Marxism getting out of hand. So we kind of agree on some, and like we kind of agree on that level. So we kind of just say it's fine, like whatever. We'll fight. But I think that not breaking it down to this level, not having a true evolutionary scientific frame, is a problem. And I think I almost think it's worth like ripping that band-aid off a little bit, like rather than trying to take these short-term wins with the Christians and the old conservatives to be like, okay, well we both believe that immigration is bad, let's work together on it. Well, if their reason for immigration is bad, it's just like, well, I don't like Mexicans, like, you know, it's like there's an evolutionary explanation for that, you know, and
Yeah.
I feel like that evolution can be the tool that we can try to use to bridge the gap, because again, the left claims to be all about science and nature and the environment and all these kind of things, and so I feel like I feel like there's some kind of reconciliation here, but ultimately one of the biggest things we run into with both Christians and the left is just that they're not really using logic at all. They're not, you know, they're just totally operating on religious, fantastical, brainwash type paradigm. So it's like, you know, in general, we kind of just need to encourage intelligence and logic and thought and try to have good conversations. But the next step is basically this. Like, this is the very first thing you want to establish with someone is like the evolutionary frame, right? So,
Yeah. Well, and as a movement, like we definitely do need our allies. So I don't want to push away the Christian right too much or be like too
right,
hostile to them. While at the
right,
same time, like there are some kind of self-defeating issues that they have in some parts of their worldview. Where yeah, we are going to have that debate, and hopefully we can have it respectfully. Um, well, and even when it comes to the left, like claiming to be pro science, there are some ways in which they're clearly not. You know, you look at their response to kind of the COVID stuff, where a lot of people on our side, you know, you kind of had two groups on our side. You had kind of the lower IQ end of the spectrum who were just like, well, we don't trust the government, we don't trust the media, so we're just not going to do what they say. And they ended up making the right decision by not trusting them. Then you have like the higher IQ end of people who were like, well, I can see that my most important immune nutrient is vitamin D, and I get it from sunlight. And they told me to stop going outside for an entire year. Obviously, they're lying to me. And the people who kind of use logic and reason to figure out that we were being lied to, and that's why we don't trust them, rather than just having that gut instinct. So
right,
you do kind of have those two groups on our side, whereas you look at the left, and they were just kind of like, well, the media says that the science says this, so I'm just going to believe what the science says, and they're almost like religious about what they believe that science says rather than actually using logic and the scientific method
right.
to figure out what
Yeah,
to do.
it's like a perversion of
So
it. Yeah,
yeah, it's kind of unfortunate that a lot of the people who claim to be pro science really are not pro science and don't actually use science in their everyday lives. And so I wish there was a way to kind of find more of the people who actually do try to think scientifically, but who are on the left in some ways. And I think there are some holdouts like that. You have kind of like your Jimmy Dore types who, as much as I disagree with people like Jimmy Dore on a lot of issues politically, at least, he can kind of see through enough of the bullshit to figure out when he's being lied to by his own side.
right,
Whereas, unfortunately, there are a lot of people on that side of the political spectrum who just can't. Who just, they get into their partisan tribalism and they're guilty of just as much tribalism as the right wingers that they criticize for being too tribalist. And fortunately, even if some parts of what they believe seem like they should be more naturally allied with us, they're so easily led that it's hard to get them over here.
right. Yeah, and what I'm thinking is like if you had just like we talked about, like whenever evolution got to the point of like sexual selection or even just replication of molecules, it just took off from there. And same whenever we're trying to connect with other people, if you have that foundation of like truth or evolution, like logic, if you can talk to someone else, no matter how different your opinions are, if you both agree, let's try to get to the truth and use science logic, that's fine. As long as you have that one arbiter, you can use that to build a huge degree of alignment. But if you can't, if that fundamental piece is missing, if someone doesn't have any logic at all, then it's like hard to even like what do you have? But I do try to stay optimistic, and I do believe that a lot of people are rational, but there are certain obstacles you have to navigate around. And I believe like what we're trying to build here is is in a good position, and it's very much like along the position of the institute and what I see them doing, which is, like you said, I wish we had like a place that was like actually doing science. And because our actual institutions have become so politicized and so perverted in terms of in the name of science, it's like we need something that who's doing actual true science. And so I see a lot of that on the institute side, but since we also know that like the religious type mechanisms of people's operating system are still key, like people are ultimately going to be wired to be social, to believe what other people do, to mock, to parrot what other people do. They need simple stories. They can't always do the full science. So I believe that's kind of where we're trying to operate in that, so that we can, like, for example, we can go to Christians and say, hey, we get a lot of what you value here, but let's try to reconcile it with this. Let's try to show how evolution is a mechanism of God's creation. So this is what we want to do over here, and then we want to go over here to the left and be like, look, we get that y'all are empathetic and compassionate, and you want to take care of everyone, and you want to design the best thing and take care of the earth and all this kind of stuff, and we do too. So, but here's the best way to do it. Like, a lot of what y'all are doing is just like they're playing on your short-term optimism and your naivety to say, let's just take care of everybody. Okay, well, we can take care of everybody right now, but that's going to destroy everything in 5 years. Whereas we can make some tougher decisions right now, like say, hey, no, sorry, we have a border. We've got to enforce certain things within here. I'm sorry. I wish the best of luck to you and your country. But ultimately, that's going to allow us to have a much better, more peaceful, compassionate, so we have to appeal to what people value. We can't just go to some of these leftists and Christians and be like, this is science, this is truth, like beat them over the head with it. We do have to account for some of those less logical facilities, but luckily, using our evolutionary frame, we understand how those things work and how they fit in. Very good.
Yeah, so hopefully we can find a solution. Because, there's a portion of the population that's smart enough that if you can give them that foundation of logical reasoning and teach them how to have a proper debate, from there, it will just kind of take off, and it's easier to lead them to our side. But then you've got a certain portion of the population who, even if you try to teach them how to use logic and how to debate properly, they're just not going to get there because they're just not smart enough, and they have to operate under a more like tribalist paradigm.
Right.
And so at some point, those of us who are thinking scientifically and have come to this point, we do kind of have to put together a way to create a new tribal paradigm that can pull a lot of those people in and get them to follow what needs to be done to build a better society, even if they aren't necessarily going to get it on a totally like logical and high IQ level there. Yeah,
and that's absolutely what we are engaged in, is like this layered approach where we can engage with those people that are logical and use that arbiter to kind of get them into the same core and help build some momentum and some basic numbers and infrastructure through that. And then we know that, okay, so then what we can do for the next portion is we can design something that's a little bit simpler, a little bit more marketed friendly, easier to understand, and that's gonna help more people kind of resonate. And then once you have that momentum, you're gonna capture the rest of the people because they're just totally just going with the flow and doing what everybody else is doing. So that's just like at least the 2 or 3 layers that we're working under. And so we have to do a lot of the legwork at the beginning. We have to really, you've got to convince those other logical people. But we can kind of be working on all threads at the same time. I think we can be already designing some like simpler ways to say things, and again, designing like a tribe and infrastructure, because we know that we are socially programmed, and that is a huge thing that we need and want, and that works is collaboration. Just like we talked about how it worked in the East, we've got to come together, we got to organize, and what better thing to organize than the pattern that has accounts for everything that we are today. It's a beautiful, it's a very beautiful spiritual religious thing. You hear the way Christians talk about it, like the power of God and His creation, and or you even hear like Buddhists or Hindus or any religious expression that's just like, wow, this is absolutely beautiful and miraculous. Well, we're talking about the mechanism that is a part of that, so it's a good place to be.
Yeah, spiritual evolutionism is kind of an untapped movement that maybe we should look into.
Yeah, I think I've joked about it. Like I said, I have considered myself at times like an evangelical evolutionist. Evolutionist,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, because it's just, I mean, that's really all you need. I mean, like, there's this idea that like truth is all you need and nature is all you need. Well, this is the very prime mechanism of nature. So and again, like yeah, we like the truth and the nature. I mean, it's in the name, the natural order. Like that's definitely a good thing. But again, like evolution is definitely the next step, and that's very much what I'm trying to engage in is this this spiritual layer. So we will definitely continue to develop that piece. I think potentially next time or in one of the next sessions we may talk a little bit more about religion and some of the esoteric kind of expressions and some of that good stuff. So it all ties together.
Yep. All right.
Cool.
Well, I think this is a good place to stop. We got quite a bit covered there.
Yeah, this is awesome. We're at about an hour 15, so we'll clip it there. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We will keep cranking these out. We're enjoying it. I hope it makes sense. You definitely feel free to comment, reach out. You know, if you have any questions or anything you'd like to hear about or how you want to get involved, we'd love to hear it. That's what we're engaged in. So looking forward to it, and see y'all next time. I'll go ahead and stop it here.
All right.